On the morning of January the 14th, 1892, in a bedroom at Sandringham House in Norfolk, a young man was dying. He was 28 years old. He was the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, second in line to the British throne, and he had been ill for 7 days. The influenza had turned to pneumonia, and the pneumonia was filling his lungs. Around the bed stood his father, the Prince of Wales, his mother, Princess Alexandra, who had not left the room, his younger brother George, a naval officer who did not yet know that his own life had just been rewritten, his fiancée, Princess Mary of Teck, who had accepted his proposal 38 days earlier and was still wearing the ring. The wedding invitations had already been sent. The chapel at Windsor was being prepared, and the groom was slipping away while the chaplain read prayers for the dying and the January light pressed gray against the windows. His name was Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, the heir who was supposed to become king. The family had spent 28 years preparing him, educating him, uniforming him, and quietly worrying about him. Now the dynasty's plan was dying in a Norfolk sick room, and a younger brother was about to inherit everything: the throne, the fiancé, the future. But that is not why you know his name. Decades after his death, men who had never met him would accuse this prince of being Jack the Ripper. This is the story of how a vulnerable, underprepared heir became the most infamous suspect in criminal history, not because of what the evidence showed, but because of what the silence allowed. But to understand how Prince Albert Victor ended up buried beneath the weight of the 20th century's most persistent murder theory, you have to go back much further than the sick room at Sandringham. You have to go back to the family that made him, the dynasty that needed him, and the machinery of image, silence, and expectation that shaped every day of his 28 years. This is the story of a young man born into the most visible family on earth who became, in death, a canvas for fears he never created. It is the story of 5 women whose murders in Whitechapel were real and brutal and unsolved. It is the story of a scandal on Cleveland Street that proved powerful men could be protected. And it is the story of the gap between those truths, the gap that conspiracy filled because silence had kept it open. It begins, as so many British stories of power do, with a woman in black. Queen Victoria's family had become, by the second half of the 19th century, the living architecture of Britain's imperial identity. The royal family's own historical account associates Victoria's reign with industrial expansion, economic progress, and the growth of an empire that stretched across continents and oceans. She had married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, and together they produced 9 children, each one a dynastic instrument, placed through marriage into the royal houses of Europe with a precision that was romantic in its language and strategic in its design. Their eldest daughter, Victoria, married the future Kaiser Friedrich III of Germany. Their son, Alfred, married the Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia. Alexandra married the future Edward VII of Denmark. Princesses Helena, Louise, and Beatrice were settled closer to home, their marriages calibrated for domestic stability. Leopold, the hemophiliac son, was given a wife and a duchy and died young. Arthur became a military figure. The network stretched from Berlin to St. Petersburg to Madrid, and the threads all ran back to Windsor. The public saw a fertility, Protestant respectability, moral seriousness, and a monarchy that seemed to be expanding itself through love. What the public did not see, because the family had not yet learned how to fail in public, was the emotional machinery beneath. Albert was not merely Victoria's husband. He was the organizing intelligence of the household, the man associated with art, science, industry, the Great Exhibition of 1851, and the belief that a modern royal family could justify itself through usefulness. He gave the monarchy a purpose beyond ceremony. He brought a German discipline to a British institution that had spent the Georgian era lurching between extravagance and scandal. And then, in December 1861, he died of typhoid fever at Windsor Castle. He was 42 years old. Victoria's grief became a national institution. She withdrew from public life for years, wore black for the rest of her reign, turned mourning into a permanent condition, and allowed her pain to become a part of the monarchy's moral theater. She commissioned memorials, preserved Albert's rooms, laid out his clothes each evening as though he might return. The important thing is not the grief itself. It is the precedent. The family's private pain became a public symbol, and Britain learned to read the monarchy not as an administrative arrangement, but as an emotional drama. one in which sorrow, duty, marriage, and loss were performed on a national stage. That performance required control. It required silence about what did not fit the image. And it required the belief, shared between the family and the public, that what the crown showed was all there was to see. There is something about that arrangement worth sitting with for a moment. Because the dynasty that Victoria and Albert built was not merely a collection of titles and palaces, it was a system of managed appearances. Privacy was not an accident of royal life, it was the organizing principle. And that principle, the conviction that the family's interior world belonged to the family alone, would define the life of the grandson who had not yet been born. It would also, decades after his death, become the very thing that made conspiracy possible. When a family teaches the world that it does not show everything, the world eventually decides that what is hidden must be monstrous. Edward, Prince of Wales, Bertie, inherited the machinery, but not the temperament. The royal family's official biography is candid about the tension. Victoria and Albert imposed a strenuous education intended to prepare their eldest son for sovereignty, and he was often overtired and rebellious. The program Albert designed for Bertie was relentless: tutors, timetables, examinations, moral instruction, and it had precisely the opposite of its intended effect. Bertie grew up not serious and disciplined, but restless, sociable, sensual, drawn to the pleasures of high society in ways that caused his mother, as the official account puts it, considerable misgiving. He gambled. He kept company with actresses and society hostesses. He was implicated in a series of social embarrassments that Victoria regarded as personal affronts. The relationship between the queen and her heir was one of the defining tensions of the late Victorian court. She distrusted his character, doubted his judgment, and kept him at arm's length from state business for decades. This matters because the pattern was already forming. Albert had tried to manufacture the perfect heir through education and control. He had failed. The son he produced was not the disciplined statesman he imagined, but a pleasure-seeking social animal whose private life was a source of constant anxiety. And Bertie, when he became a father himself, would face exactly the same problem, but worse. Because the son born to him at Frogmore would prove resistant not merely to discipline, but to engagement itself. Bertie married Princess Alexandra of Denmark on March the 10th, 1863, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Alexandra was 18, graceful, warm, and already adored by the British public before she set foot in the country. She had been chosen partly for her beauty, partly for the Danish alliance, and partly because Victoria hoped that a good wife might steady her wayward son. The same logic that would later be applied to Eddie. Their marriage brought beauty and the Danish royal connection into the family. And in its early years, it also brought something like genuine affection. Bertie was charmed by Alexandra's warmth and uncomplicated goodness. Alexandra loved her husband with a loyalty that would survive decades of humiliation. But Bertie's appetites did not diminish with marriage. He maintained a social life that ran parallel to his domestic one. A world of country house weekends, late dinners, a racing at Ascot and Goodwood, and a succession of relationships with women whose names circulated in society with varying degrees of discretion. Alexandra, increasingly deaf as the years passed, increasingly aware of her husband's attachments to other women, and increasingly unable to compete with the sophisticated hostesses who held his attention, retreated into motherhood as her primary emotional territory. Her children became the center of her world, and she treated them with an indulgence that compensated for everything her marriage could not provide. That indulgence would shape Eddie profoundly. He was raised not in the rigorous Albertine tradition that his grandmother demanded, but in Alexandra's softer, more forgiving atmosphere. And the gap between what his mother gave him and what the crown would eventually require of him grew wider with every year. Their first child arrived the following year. On January the 8th, 1864, at Frogmore House on the Windsor estate, Alexandra gave birth prematurely to a boy. He was 2 months early. The labor was difficult. The doctors summoned to attend were not all present in time. The child was small, fragile, and named with the full weight of dynastic expectation. Albert Victor, Christian Edward. The first name for his dead grandfather, the second for the queen, the third and fourth for his father's names. The boy was second in line to the throne from the moment he breathed, and already, before Albert Victor had drawn a full month of breath, the contradiction was in place. He was born into a family where pleasure, duty, public image, and maternal disapproval were braided together so tightly that no single thread could be pulled without disturbing the others. His father was being managed by his grandmother was performing Gryphus governance. His mother was the beautiful wife of a man whose appetites were an open secret in every London drawing room. The child would be raised inside that tangle and expected somehow to emerge from it as a king. The properties of the dynasty functioned as emotional geography, and to understand the family, you had to understand the houses. Frogmore House, where Albert Victor was born, sat in the private grounds of Windsor Castle, a residence associated with Albert's memory and Victoria's retreat, a place where grief and grandeur lived in the same corridors. Marlborough House in Pall Mall served as the Prince and Princess of Wales's London centre, the social heart of Bertie's world, a place of dinners, receptions, the prince's racing associates and society hostesses, the glamour that made the Wales household feel like a rival court to Victoria's austere Windsor. Sandringham House in Norfolk, purchased by the Prince of Wales in 1862 for a reported £104,000, became the family's domestic retreat. The house was extended, the grounds improved, the estate run as a working farm. It was here that the family could appear most convincingly domestic, shooting weekends, birthday gatherings, the children playing in the grounds. And it was here, decades later, that Albert Victor would die. Balmoral and Abergele Castle in the Scottish Highlands offered the further fiction of informality, deer stalking, family gatherings, Highland air, and the illusion that a family carrying the weight of an empire might also be ordinary. The court circular recorded their movements between these properties with bland precision. Arrivals, departures, guests received, services attended, and anyone who read it carefully could reconstruct, almost to the day, where each member of the family was at any given time. That documentary trail would matter enormously when, years later, men needed to prove or disprove whether a prince had been in London on specific autumn nights in 1888. But for now, the houses were simply the architecture of a particular kind of childhood. A childhood lived in large rooms, attended by servants, governed by tutors, photographed in sailor suits, presented to visiting dignitaries, and sheltered from any contact with the world that existed beyond the estate walls and the court circular's polite notations. The family's wealth should be understood not as a single fortune, but as insulation. This was not a country house dynasty built on one estate or one industrial venture. It was the sovereign family, funded by parliamentary settlement through the civil list, by income from the Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster, by royal property accumulated over centuries, and by the accumulated capital of dynastic marriages that had connected the British crown to every major fortune in European royalty. The relevant financial detail is not a balance sheet. It is the permanent expectation that the heir would be carried by tutors, equerries, aides de camp, doctors, household staff, press deference, and political caution. Albert Victor would never need to earn a living, prove a talent, or demonstrate independent competence. The system would provide for him regardless. And that provision, which looked like privilege from the outside, was also a kind of erasure. A man who is always carried never discovers whether he can walk. A prince who is always managed never learns what he might have been without the management. The family code that Victoria and Albert had established demanded visible virtue. It demanded Protestant duty, suitable marriage, public composure, and the performance of seriousness even when the private reality was otherwise. Bertie had already demonstrated what happened when the code was broken. He was treated with suspicion by his own mother, whispered about in society, and managed rather than trusted. The lesson was clear, even if it was never stated as such. The heir must be prepared but never exposed, trained but never humiliated, married suitably even if temperament and desire did not align, protected from scandal even when the act of protection created the very suspicion it was designed to prevent. That was the dynasty's first and deepest contradiction. It demanded public virtue while requiring private management, and the child born at Frogmore in 1864 would spend his entire short life caught inside it. Victoria was the dynastic matriarch and the moral atmosphere. She was not the villain of Alba Victor's story. She was the woman who had turned family into monarchy and monarchy into family, and who could not see that the two might require different things from the people trapped inside them. For Eddie, the family nickname that would follow the prince to his grave and far beyond it, she represented judgment, expectation, and the unshakable conviction that a person could be selected, arranged, educated, married, and improved into suitability. Her affection for her grandchildren was real. Her faith that the right wife, the right appointment, the right title could repair whatever was wrong with the heir was equally real and equally wrong. Prince Albert himself was dead before his grandson's birth, but his absence was a presence in every room. The boy was named partly for him. The household standards, seriousness, discipline, moral purpose, useful industry, were Albert's standards preserved by Victoria, like the rooms she maintained in his memory. Albert Victor's tragedy, which would become visible only gradually, was that he was born into an Albertine ideal he could never convincingly inhabit. The family wanted another Albert. They got something else entirely, and they would spend 2 decades trying to turn one into the other. Edward, Prince of Wales, was father, heir, social operator, and increasingly anxious parent. He had been overeducated by Albert's rigid system and had rebelled against it, not through intellectual defiance, but through the pursuit of pleasure and company that his mother found so threatening. And then he confronted in his own eldest son a different kind of failure. Albert Victor was not rebellious in the way Bertie had been. He was not restless, not actively resistant, not pushing against the boundaries. He was languid, elusive, difficult to rouse. And that quality, which might have been temperamental or neurological or simply the product of a sheltered and unstimulated early childhood, frightened his father in a way that open rebellion never had. Rebellion at least suggested energy. What Edward saw in Eddie was something closer to absence. His irritation was real. His teasing could be sharp. But the documentary must resist making him cruel because his frustration came partly from fear. The monarchy's future might depend on a son who seemed incapable of carrying it. And Edward, who knew better than almost anyone alive what the crown demanded of its heirs and what it cost them when they fell short, could see no clear way to install in Eddie the force of character that nature had not provided. Alexandra, Princess of Wales, was the emotional counterweight to everything her husband's world represented. Beautiful, warm, increasingly enclosed by her deafness as the years passed, she cherished her children with a tenderness that Bertie's world of clubs and mistresses could not diminish. Her instinct with Eddie was protective above all else. She saw in him not a deficient heir, but a gentle, affectionate boy who needed shielding from the machinery that was trying to reshape him. She smoothed his edges, softened his failures, kept him close. Her arc in this story is one of devotion that could not save and grief that could not release. After Eddie's death, according to later accounts reported by royal historians, she kept the room where he died at Sandringham as a kind of shrine. Personal objects preserved, flowers maintained, the space held in a permanent suspension between memory and mourning. That detail should be heard for what it was, not madness, not melodrama. A mother holding on to the only version of her son that had not been taken from her, Albert Victor himself. There's something about him that resists the clarity a story of this kind wants to impose. He was born prematurely at Frogmore on January the 8th, 1864. The Dictionary of National Biography gives the formal path of his life with bureaucratic precision: baptism, naval education, world cruise, Trinity College, Army, India, dukedom, engagement, death. Each milestone arrived on schedule. Each institution received him. Each uniform was fitted. But the emotional story sits in the gaps between those milestones, in the silences that contemporaries filled with doubt and that later writers would fill with fantasy. He was handsome. That much is beyond dispute. The National Portrait Gallery holds images of a young man with a long face, heavy-lidded eyes, and the kind of looks that photograph well and reveal little. He was good-natured by many accounts, agreeable, pleasant in company, without malice or pretension. But the Oxford Companion's biographical summary is severe in its assessment. His health had caused anxiety from the start. At 5 years old, he was described as languid and listless. One tutor called his faculties abnormally dormant. Another said he scarcely understood what it meant to read. The script must be careful here. Those assessments are real, and they matter, but they are not a diagnosis. Attempts to retrospectively identify deafness, learning difficulties, or developmental conditions are speculative. What can be said with confidence is that contemporaries and later historians repeatedly describe Albert Victor as slow, lethargic, and resistant to education, and that the family responded to those descriptions not with acceptance, not with adaptation, not with any recalibration of expectation, but with intensified management, more tutors, more travel, more uniforms, more hope that the next institution would accomplish what the last had not. The remedy, always, was another application of the same machinery, and the machinery always produced the same result. Prince George, 2 years younger, quicker, more responsive, built for the structured world of naval discipline in ways his brother simply was not, occupied the other half of a dynastic equation that neither brother chose. George was the spare, the second son, the boy who was not the future. Where Eddie drifted through lessons and appointments with a kind of polite inattention, George engaged. He took to naval training with a readiness that delighted his instructors and deepened his parents' unspoken anxiety about his elder brother. The contrast between them was not subtle. It was visible to everyone who spent time with both princes, and it created a particular kind of tension within the household. Not rivalry, because Eddie does not appear to have been competitive, but a quiet, persistent awareness that the dynasty had invested its hopes in the wrong brother. George's official biography is almost blunt about the pivot that changed everything. Albert Victor's sudden death in January 1892 ended George's naval career and placed him in the direct line of succession. George later married Albert Victor's fiancée, Mary of Teck, in 1893. That is the spare's inheritance compressed into a single paragraph. The brother built for a naval life becomes king because the public heir disappears, and the woman who was to have been one brother's wife becomes the other brother's queen. George would carry that inheritance with a sense of duty so rigid it sometimes resembled punishment. But that was still years away. Princess Mary of Teck, May to the family, entered the story as a solution to a problem she did not create. She was the daughter of Francis, Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of George III. The Teck family had royal blood but limited means. Her mother was famously generous and famously in debt, and the family had spent years living abroad in Florence to economize before returning to a more modest establishment at White Lodge in Richmond Park. May grew up in an atmosphere where royal lineage and financial anxiety coexisted in the same household, and that combination produced in her a discipline, a practicality, and a self-possession that the Wales household conspicuously lacked. She had been identified as a suitable bride for Eddie, intelligent, steady, and serious in all the ways the prince was not. She accepted his proposal on December the 7th, 1891, and in doing so she accepted a future that would last exactly 38 days before death took it from her. She would stand at the threshold of one life and be redirected into another, not as a passive pawn, but as a woman whose remarkable adaptability would eventually make her one of the most formidable queens consort of the 20th century. That redirection, from Eddie to George, from one brother to the other, is one of the quietest and most extraordinary pivots in modern British royal history. It happened without public debate. It happened because monarchy requires continuity, and continuity sometimes requires the rearrangement of human beings. Princess Alix of Hesse represented the match that did not happen, and the rejection that spoke volumes. Queen Victoria had hoped for Eddie and Alix, a union that would have kept the bloodline close and the family network tight. Alix turned him down. The reasons were never fully made public, but the refusal itself matters. The great prize of the British succession did not appear as desirable from inside the family network as it did from outside. Whatever Alix saw or sensed or was told about her cousin, she chose a different path. She would marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia instead, and her fate, Ekaterinburg, the cellar, the summer of 1918, would be unimaginably worse. But in the immediate context of Eddie's story, her rejection was a dynastic warning that the family preferred not to hear. Princess Hélène of Orléans brought something more volatile into the picture. Genuine romantic attachment, blocked by religion and dynastic politics. She was Catholic. Eddie was Anglican and heir to a throne constitutionally inseparable from the Church of England. The match was raised, discussed, and, according to some accounts, Hélène offered to convert, and Eddie raised the possibility with Victoria himself. The Queen was not unsympathetic, but the constitutional obstacles were immovable. The Pope would not sanction the conversion. The politicians would not tolerate the risk. The failed match gave the story a dimension that the official chronicle preferred to suppress. Eddie was not only a future king being managed by committees and tutors, he was a young man whose personal affections could not survive the requirements of the crown. Whether his feelings for Helen were deep love or youthful infatuation is unknowable at this distance. What is known is that the attachment was real enough to be raised with the queen, real enough to involve Rome, and real enough to be crushed by both. The family took shape around these pressures in the years that followed Eddie's birth. He was privately educated at first by a succession of tutors whose reports varied between cautious optimism and quiet despair. Then came the appointment that would later acquire its own shadow. James Kenneth Stephen, a brilliant young man from a distinguished intellectual family, his father was Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, the judge and legal scholar, was engaged to tutor Eddie before and during his time at Cambridge. Stephen was everything Eddie was not: sharp, literary, intensely cerebral. The contrast between tutor and pupil was the contrast between the life of the mind and the life of managed expectation, and it served as yet another reminder that the institutions being applied to the prince were not transforming him, they were simply passing through him. In 1877, Eddie and George were placed aboard HMS Britannia at Dartmouth. The brothers entered together because Eddie's previous tutors believed he might benefit from his younger brother's company and example, a detail that quietly inverted the usual dynastic hierarchy. The heir was being propped up by despair before either of them was old enough to understand what those words would come to mean. On the Britannia, George thrived. Eddie endured. The pattern had already set. At Marlborough House in Sandringham, the household settled into its rhythms. Edward entertained, traveled, pursued his social and romantic interests with an energy that the press noted and the public half admired. Alexandra mothered, protected, and retreated further into the domestic world that her deafness made increasingly enclosed. The children, Eddie, George, and their sisters Louise, Victoria, and Maud, moved through the expected choreography of a royal childhood: lessons with private tutors, appearances at family gatherings, summers at Balmoral and Osborne, the court circular recording their movements with the bland precision of a family that believed documentation was the same thing as transparency. The sisters would grow into their own lives. Louise would marry the Duke of Fife. Maud would become Queen of Norway. But in the 1870s and early 80s, they were simply the backdrop of a household organized around one overwhelming question: what was to be done about Eddie? That question shaped conversations that the family kept entirely private. Edward discussed it with Victoria. Victoria discussed it with her advisors. Alexandra deflected it with affection. And the answers, when they came, were always the same: another institution, another uniform, another attempt to press the boy into the mold the dynasty required. The family's capacity for self-examination extended only as far as the question of method, never as far as the question of whether the mold itself might be wrong. But beneath the surface, the gap between the public image and the private anxiety was already widening. Eddie was liked by many who met him, but trusted by few with real responsibility. He was high-born, but vulnerable to whispers about his capacity. His father wanted him roused into something sharper. His grandmother wanted him settled into a suitable marriage. His mother wanted him shielded from the judgments that she sensed gathering around him. And the young man himself, growing taller, being photographed in uniform, presented to the world in the braid and ceremonial promise of the 10th Hussars, remained difficult to read. Was he slow or merely unstimulated? Was he gentle or vacant? Was he the disappointment his critics described, or simply a person profoundly unsuited to the single role that the accident of birth had assigned him? Those questions had no public forum in the 1880s. The family did not discuss such things outside its own walls. The press did not yet have the appetite or the legal license to ask them. And so the questions accumulated in the only place Victorian doubt could safely gather. Behind the name, beneath the image, inside the silence that the dynasty had spent a generation constructing. That silence would hold for years. It would hold through scandal and through death and through the careful rearrangement of everything the family had planned. And then, in the autumn of 1888, while the photographers were still fixing the image of Prince Albert Victor in his cavalry uniform for posterity, London began producing another image entirely: one of fog, poverty, narrow courts, anonymous lodging houses, and 5 women whose deaths would become the most enduring, unsolved mystery of the Victorian age. The prince and the murders existed in the same city, under the same queen, in the same year. That proximity would not matter for decades, but when it finally did, it would consume him entirely. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. The remedy chosen for Prince Albert Victor was the one the Victorian establishment trusted above all others: the sea. In 1877, at the age of 13, Eddie was placed aboard HMS Britannia at Dartmouth alongside his younger brother George. The Royal Navy was not merely a career for princes. It was a finishing school, a character factory, a place where the empire's values, hierarchy, discipline, endurance, the suppression of private feeling in favor of collective duty, were applied with physical force to boys who had no choice but to absorb them. The theory was sound. A prince who could not be reached by tutors might be reached by the ocean. The structured world of watches, drills, seamanship, and shared quarters would strip away the softness that Alexandra's household had encouraged and replace it with something the dynasty could use. George took to the Britannia with an enthusiasm that confirmed what the family already suspected. The younger brother was the more capable one. He adapted to the routine, earned the respect of his instructors, and showed a steadiness that would later define his reign. Eddie endured. He was not defiant, he was not disruptive. He was simply present without being engaged, a quality that frustrated his superiors precisely because it offered no clear surface to push against. Rebellion could be disciplined. Absence of a different kind could not. In 1879, the experiment was intensified. Both brothers were sent on a 3-year cruise aboard HMS Bacchante, a corvette with a complement of officers, crew, and the watchful presence of their tutor, John Neil Dalton, who accompanied them throughout. The voyage was designed to expose the princes to the breadth of the empire and the world beyond it. They sailed to the Mediterranean, to South America, to South Africa, to Australia, to Japan, to Egypt, to the Holy Land. The itinerary was imperial education rendered as geography. Every port of call a lesson in British reach, British trade, British power. In Gibraltar, they saw the fortress. In the Falklands, they saw the edges. In Australia, they saw the colonies that bore the crown's name and followed the crown's customs across 12,000 miles of ocean. The Bacchante voyage produced a published journal, co-authored in the prince's names, though heavily edited and widely understood to have been shaped by Dalton rather than by the boys themselves, and a set of photographs showing 2 young men in naval dress against a backdrop of empire. The public version was romance, the future king sailing the world, absorbing its lessons, preparing himself for the throne that awaited him. Newspapers reported on their progress with affectionate interest. The monarchy was renewing itself through its young, and the young were being forged by the sea. The private version was quieter and more familiar. George absorbed the discipline, the routine, the camaraderie. He belonged on a ship. Eddie did not. Dalton's reports continued the pattern of cautious concern that had followed the prince since childhood. The sea had not done what the classroom could not. 3 years of empire, 3 years of wind and port and foreign shore, and the air remained essentially unchanged, unpleasant, passive, and resistant to the transformation the voyage was designed to achieve. There is something about that failure worth holding in mind, not because it diminishes Eddie. He was, by every account, a pleasant and likable young man at sea, but because it reveals the limits of the family's imagination. When one remedy did not work, they did not ask whether the problem had been misdiagnosed. They applied another remedy and another and another. The machine never questioned itself. It only increased the pressure. After the Bacchante, the brothers were separated for the first time. George continued his naval career, the path that suited him, the path that would be cut short by his brother's death. Eddie was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1883, under the continued intellectual supervision of James Kenneth Stephen. The choice of Cambridge was deliberate. The university was expected to accomplish what 3 years at sea had not: to awaken something in the prince, to connect him to the world of ideas, to give his character the intellectual foundation that his role demanded. Stephen, who was brilliant and intense, represented the best the academic world could offer as a companion for the heir. Cambridge, in the 1880s, was an institution of enormous social and intellectual prestige. Its courts and halls had produced prime ministers, poets, scientists, and the administrative class that ran the empire. For a prince to pass through Trinity was to be placed in the company of England's sharpest minds, its most ambitious young men, its future bishops and barristers and colonial administrators. The hope was that proximity to that world would produce, if not scholarship, at least a kind of intellectual confidence, a fluency with ideas that a future king would need. It did not happen. Eddie received tuition, attended lectures, and was awarded an honorary LL.D., a degree that reflected his rank rather than his scholarship. He was treated with the deference his position demanded, which meant that no one was in a position to challenge him, to push him, to insist that he engage. The emotional reality should be understood plainly. He passed through Cambridge, but Cambridge does not appear to have passed through him. No letters survive that suggest intellectual awakening. No tutors recorded a transformation. Stephen, whose own trajectory would later darken, he suffered a serious head injury in the mid 1880s that altered his personality, and he would die in an asylum in 1892. The same year as Eddie, left no record of having reached his pupil in any lasting way. The prince emerged from the university as he had entered it, agreeable, handsome, and unaltered. The army followed. Eddie was gazetted as a lieutenant in the 10th Hussars in 1886, promoted to major in 1889, and held a succession of military appointments that placed him in uniform at the right occasions, before the right audiences. The 10th Hussars were based at York, and Eddie's time with the regiment gave him a role that was, for perhaps the first time in his life, structured around something other than the expectation of intellectual improvement. He was not required to debate. He was not required to write essays. He was required to appear, to drill, to ride, to be present in a uniform that carried its own authority. And by several accounts, he was not unhappy in the army. The social life of a cavalry regiment, the mess dinners, the hunting, the dances, the easy camaraderie of men whose rank was assured, suited a temperament that had always been sociable even when it was not scholarly. The portraits from this period are the public image at its most persuasive. The National Portrait Gallery holds photographs and paintings of a young man arranged in braid, medals, and ceremonial promise, tall, slim, with the high collar and heavy-lidded gaze that the late Victorian camera loved. He looked like a prince. He looked like a future king. He looked like exactly what the dynasty needed him to be. The gap between that image and the private reality, a young man whose family discussed his limitations in letters they assumed would never be read by the public, was the gap that defined his life. But looking was not the same as being, and the people closest to him knew the difference. Edward continued to fret about his son's lack of force and initiative. Victoria continued to press for a suitable marriage with an urgency that increased as the prince moved through his 20s without acquiring the domestic stability the family considered essential. Advisers discussed, with varying degrees of delicacy, whether Eddie might benefit from a period of supervised responsibility overseas. Ireland was mentioned as a possible vice-regal appointment, a role that would give him visible authority without requiring independent judgment. India was attempted first. In late 1889, Eddie toured the subcontinent with a small entourage, visiting the jewel of the empire his grandmother represented. He saw Bombay and Calcutta and the princely states. He shot tigers. He attended durbars. The trip was another attempt at the same cure. Movement, spectacle, the world brought before the prince, in the hope that scale would produce seriousness. Whether it did or not is impossible to say from the surviving record. What is clear is that the family was running out of institutions to try, and the young man who returned from India was recognizably the same young man who had left. The marriage question became more urgent with each passing year, not merely as a social expectation, but as a political strategy. A prince of Eddie's age and position was expected to marry, and the marriage was expected to solve things that every other institution had failed to solve. A suitable wife would provide domestic stability, public respectability, a nursery, an anchor, and the appearance of maturity, even if the substance remained uncertain. The right woman might manage Eddie where tutors, officers, and universities could not. She might give him purpose. She might give the family peace. Alex of Hesse was approached and declined, a refusal that stung the family and raised questions they preferred not to answer about how the prince appeared to those who knew the family from the inside. Helene of Orleans was pursued with genuine emotion, but blocked by the impassable wall of religion and constitutional law. Other names circulated in the family's private correspondence. Women of appropriate rank, appropriate temperament, appropriate willingness to take on what the family privately acknowledged was a difficult assignment. The search had a particular quality of desperation beneath its surface civility. The family was not simply looking for a bride. It was looking for a solution to a problem it could not name in public. And while the family searched, while the tutors reported, while the uniforms were fitted and the portraits taken, and the court circular recorded the prince's movements from Sandringham to York, to Abergeldy, to London, with metronomic regularity, something was happening in a part of London that the court circular never mentioned and the royal household never visited. In the autumn of 1888, in the narrow streets and lodging houses east of the city of London, 5 women were murdered. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were killed between August the 31st and November the 9th of that year in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, districts of extreme poverty, overcrowding, casual labor, and the kind of desperation that Victorian respectability preferred not to see. The National Archives notes that the Metropolitan Police file on the case contains hundreds of letters claiming to be from the murderer, many of them signed with the name that would outlast every other detail of the case, Jack the Ripper. The London Museum's summary is plain and sufficient. 5 women were murdered. The killer was never identified. The name became legend. The script must be careful about how it treats these women. For more than a century, they were reduced to a category, victims of Jack the Ripper, and that category was itself reduced to an assumption about how they lived. The historian Hallie Rubenhold, as Britannica notes, challenged the long-standing presumption that all 5 canonical victims were sex workers, arguing that this assumption reflected Victorian prejudice rather than documented fact. What is known is that these were women living in conditions of extreme precarity. Mary Ann Nichols was separated from her husband, moving between workhouses and lodging houses. Annie Chapman was a widow in declining health. Elizabeth Stride was a Swedish-born immigrant. Catherine Eddowes had been released from a police cell for drunkenness hours before her death. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest, living in a rented room in Miller's Court, Dorset Street. They had names, they had histories, they had lives that mattered independently of how they died. Their murders mattered to this story not because Prince Albert Victor committed them, the evidence strongly indicates he did not, but because of what Whitechapel represented. The East End of London in 1888 was the other side of the imperial mirror. While the court circular recorded the prince's shooting weekends and regimental dinners, while Marlborough House glittered with the Prince of Wales's guests, while Sandringham prepared for another season of family gatherings and country sport, Whitechapel was producing a different kind of record entirely. Overcrowded lodging houses charging 4 pence a night for a bed and sometimes less for a place on the floor. Streets where violence, domestic, criminal, casual, was woven into the fabric of daily life. Women whose poverty made them visible to the authorities only when they entered the workhouse or when their deaths became spectacular enough to sell newspapers. A metropolitan police force that was stretched thin, poorly equipped for forensic investigation, and unable to protect the people it was theoretically employed to serve. The murders exposed, with a force that no parliamentary debate or newspaper editorial had managed, the moral fracture at the center of Victorian society. The same city that hosted the Prince's Whirl, the same London under the same queen in the same autumn, had produced the conditions in which 5 women could be killed, one after another, over the course of 10 weeks, without the killer ever being identified. The distance between Marlborough House and Miller's Court was not merely geographical. It was the distance between 2 entirely separate experiences of what it meant to live in the capital of the greatest empire on earth. The press response was enormous and immediate. The penny papers, the illustrated weeklies, the respectable broadsheets all gave the Whitechapel murders sustained coverage that mixed genuine horror with something more complicated, fascination. London consumed the murders as spectacle. The Illustrated Police News published lurid illustrations. The Star and the Pall Mall Gazette ran daily updates. The killer's apparent ability to evade detection became a public obsession, a source of both fear and a strange ghoulish entertainment. The letters sent to police and press, most of them hoaxes, as the National Archives confirms, fed a narrative of taunting theatrical evil that transformed a real series of crimes against real women into a gothic entertainment whose central character was the murderer, not the murdered. The name Jack the Ripper, almost certainly invented by a journalist or hoaxer rather than the actual killer, became the most famous pseudonym in criminal history. It still is. Now put Prince Albert Victor against the calendar, and something important becomes clear. 2 Britons existed in the same autumn, and the documentary record lets us see both of them simultaneously. On September the 8th, 1888, the date Annie Chapman was murdered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields. Her body discovered by a lodger named John Davis at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. Contemporary press reports place Prince Albert Victor leaving Danby Lodge in Yorkshire to rejoin the 10th hussars at York. He was in the north of England, documented, accounted for, living in the world of regimental routine and country house visits that was as far from Hanbury Street as it was possible to be, while remaining in the same country. On September the 30th, the night of the so-called double event, when Elizabeth Stride was killed in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street and Catherine Edwards was murdered in Mitre Square within the space of an hour. Press records and court circular entries placed Eddie with the royal party at Abergeldy near Balmoral. He was in Scotland, hundreds of miles from Whitechapel, in the company of family and household staff whose movements were recorded with the precision that the court circular demanded. On November the 9th, the date of Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the most violent and most enclosed of the five, committed behind a locked door in a rented room in Miller's Court, records place Eddie at Sandringham, in Norfolk, attending celebrations for the Prince of Wales's birthday. These alibis should not be treated as a courtroom defense, because Albert Victor was never charged, never arrested, never formally suspected by the Metropolitan Police during the actual investigation. The police files held at the National Archives contain extensive documentation of suspects, tip-offs, informants, and investigative dead ends. Prince Albert Victor does not feature in them as a suspect, not once. The alibis matter for a different reason entirely. They demonstrate that the conspiracy theory that would later consume his reputation was not built on evidence. It was built on something else altogether, on the feeling, cultivated by decades of royal secrecy, that the establishment was capable of hiding anything, including murder, including mutilation, including the truth about who the most protected young man in England really was. That feeling did not come from nowhere, and the event that gave it its most powerful fuel was not the Whitechapel murders. It was what happened the following year in a narrow street in Fitzrovia. In the summer of 1889, a routine investigation by the Metropolitan Police into the theft of money from the General Post Office led by a series of unremarkable steps to a discovery that was anything but routine. A 15-year-old telegraph boy named Charles Swinscow was found to have more money than his wages at the post office could explain. He was earning just 11 shillings a week. The extra money, under questioning, was traced to a source that the police had not anticipated: a house at 19 Cleveland Street, near the Tottenham Court Road in the respectable district of Fitzrovia. The house was run by a man named Charles Hammond. It was a male brothel. The discovery was not in itself unprecedented. London had an underworld of such establishments, known to the police and tolerated to varying degrees depending on how discreetly they operated. What made Cleveland Street different was the clientele. As the investigation widened, more telegraph boys were identified as having visited the house. Young working-class men earning small wages and supplementing them with money from wealthy clients. And then the names of those clients began to surface, and the names began to climb the social ladder with an alarming speed. The investigation widened, more telegraph boys were identified as having visited the house, and then the names began to climb. Lord Arthur Somerset, known as Podge, the superintendent of the Prince of Wales's stables and an equerry in the royal household, was identified as a client. The Earl of Euston was named. Rumors reached further, touching the edges of the royal family itself. Albert Victor's name was whispered, though no direct evidence placed him at the house. The legal context was crucial, and it is impossible to understand the scandal's power without understanding the law that created it. Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, 1885. The Labouchere Amendment, named for the Liberal MP Henry Labouchere, who introduced it as a late addition to a bill originally focused on the protection of women and girls, had criminalized all acts of gross indecency between men, dramatically widening the scope of the law beyond the previous offense of sodomy. The amendment was broad, vague, and punitive. It meant that any sexual contact between men, however private, however consensual, was now a criminal offense punishable by up to 2 years' hard labor. It was the same law that would be used to prosecute Oscar Wilde 6 years later. Cleveland Street did not merely expose a brothel. It exposed a world in which working-class boys, aristocratic clients, police discretion, political pressure, and press insinuation collided with devastating force. The power of the Cleveland Street scandal was not the sexual acts themselves. It was the cover-up, or what appeared to be a cover-up. Hammond, the brothel keeper, fled to the continent before he could be arrested. Lord Arthur Somerset was allowed to leave the country. He never returned to England. The 2 telegraph boys who had provided testimony were convicted and imprisoned, while the aristocratic clients were protected by legal maneuvering, political discretion, and the unspoken understanding that men of title were not subjected to the same justice as boys of no account. The press reaction split along predictable lines. The established papers were cautious, constrained by libel law and the ingrained deference of the Victorian press towards rank. But Ernest Park, the editor of the North London Press, was less restrained. He published the Earl of Euston's name. He asked publicly and repeatedly why the prosecution was being managed to protect certain individuals. He was sued for criminal libel by Euston, convicted, and sentenced to 12 months imprisonment. The man who asked why aristocrats were being shielded went to prison. The aristocrats were not prosecuted. The relevance to Albert Victor is both direct and indirect. Direct, because his name was attached to the scandal and rumor, whispered in certain circles, reported in overseas newspapers, less constrained by British libel law, never substantiated by documentary evidence that has survived. The script must be precise here. There were rumors connecting the prince to Cleveland Street, but the surviving evidence does not confirm that he was a client. What the evidence does confirm is that the investigation was handled in a way that prioritized the protection of powerful names and that the public understood this perfectly well. Indirect, and more importantly, because Cleveland Street created a template. It demonstrated in public and in detail that the Victorian establishment was willing to let working class boys go to prison while allowing men of rank and connection to escape abroad. It showed that the press could be punished for asking uncomfortable questions. It proved that proximity to the crown carried a kind of immunity that extended beyond legal privilege into the management of truth itself. That template would matter enormously in the decades ahead, because when men later claimed that Prince Albert Victor had been Jack the Ripper and that the murders had been committed to protect a royal secret, the claim derived its emotional power not from the evidence, which was thin to non-existent, but from the proven reality that the establishment had in fact protected royal adjacent men from consequences. Cleveland Street made the conspiracy believable. Not true, believable. And in the world of public imagination, believable was more than enough. The immediate consequences within the family were managed with the same tools the dynasty always used: movement, title, and the redirection of attention. The Cleveland Street scandal broke in the summer and autumn of 1889. By late 1889, Eddie was being sent to India, a tour that served the dual purpose of imperial education and physical removal from the atmosphere of London gossip. By May 1890, he was being created Duke of Clarence and Avondale and Earl of Athlone, titles that were meant to signal stability and progression, to say to the public, this is not a young man drifting through rumor. This is a prince advancing through the ranks of duty. By the end of 1891, he was engaged to Mary of Teck. Each step was designed to move him forward, to overlay the whispers with new narrative, to present to the public a prince who was progressing through the expected milestones of royal life, rather than one whose name had been murmured in connection with a house in Fitzrovia. Edward, who understood the social world better than anyone in the family, knew what was at stake. His own reputation had survived decades of private indiscretion because he was charming, forceful, and socially indispensable, qualities that Eddie did not share. A scandal that Bertie could have weathered through sheer social power might destroy a son who lacked the personality to fight back. Alexandra, characteristically, drew closer to Eddie rather than questioning him. She did not interrogate, she protected. Victoria, at Balmoral and Windsor, received the intelligence that her advisors chose to share and pressed harder for the marriage that she believed would settle everything. The family's response to Cleveland Street was, in miniature, the family's response to everything that threatened the image: manage the surface, move the person, change the subject, and trust that the public's deference would hold. For generations, that strategy had worked. The press was constrained, the public was respectful. The machinery of discretion, equerries, private secretaries, household staff whose loyalty was assumed and whose silence was required, functioned as it always had. But the whispers did not stop. They never do, in a culture built on silence. The Cleveland Street scandal had introduced an idea into the public imagination that the family could not retract. There were things about the Queen's grandson that the establishment did not want known. What those things were remained undefined: sexuality, scandal, incapacity, something worse. And the lack of definition was precisely what made the idea so durable. A specific accusation can be answered. A general suspicion cannot. It hangs in the air. It attaches itself to every subsequent event. It grows in the dark. By the end of 1889, nothing had been proven. Eddie's name had not appeared in any court proceeding. No evidence connected him directly to the house on Cleveland Street. The Metropolitan Police had closed their investigation into the Whitechapel murders without identifying a suspect, and the prince's name was nowhere in their files. But something had shifted beneath the surface of his story. The public did not yet know it. The press did not yet have the language for it. Even the family, with its extraordinary capacity for managing appearances, may not have fully understood what had changed. What had changed was this: Prince Albert Victor had become a figure onto whom suspicion could be projected. He was high-born but not forceful. He was titled but not trusted with real authority. He was visible in the court circular but not transparent in any way that mattered. And the institutions that surrounded him, the monarchy, the police, the government, the press, had demonstrated through their handling of Cleveland Street that they were capable of protecting powerful men from the consequences of their private lives. In a society that ran on deference and secrecy, that demonstration was more dangerous than any single scandal. It meant that the next time something terrible happened and the establishment appeared to close ranks, the public would have a framework for believing that the truth was being hidden. And they would look, inevitably, toward the most protected figure they could find. The prince was 25 years old. He had been managed, educated, uniformed, traveled, titled, and whispered about. He had not yet been accused of murder. That would come later, long after he was dead, from men he never met, in books he never read, for reasons that had less to do with evidence than with the irresistible power of a story that fitted the shape of a fear the Victorian age had created but could not answer. That accusation was still decades away. What was immediate, what was pressing, what the family was focused on at the close of 1889 was a simpler and more familiar problem. Eddie needed to be settled. He needed a wife. He needed a role. He needed to be fixed in place before the whispers became louder than the court circular could drown out. The machinery of the dynasty was already in motion. A dukedom was being prepared. A bride was being identified. A future was being assembled, piece by careful piece, around a young man who had spent his entire life being assembled by others. Whether that future would hold, whether the machinery could move fast enough to outrun the doubt, was not yet a question anyone was asking aloud. On May the 24th, 1890, Queen Victoria created her grandson, Duke of Clarence and Avondale and Earl of Athlone. The titles were announced with the formal language of the London Gazette and received with the public interest that any royal creation commanded. A dukedom was a significant honor, a statement of rank, of position, of the dynasty's confidence in its heir. The Duke of Clarence and Avondale was now a man of consequence in the peerage as well as in the line of succession. The title carried with it the expectation of a household, a seat, a public role, and eventually a wife, who would share the dignity of the name. But titles, like uniforms, are things that are put on a person. They do not change what is inside. And the family knew, though they would never have said so in any document intended for public consumption, that the dukedom was less a reward for achievement than a remedy for anxiety. Eddie had been through Dartmouth, the Bacchante, Cambridge, the 10th Hussars, and India. He had been educated, traveled, uniformed, and documented. He had not been transformed. The dukedom was the next instrument in a strategy that had been consistent since the prince's childhood. When the person could not be changed, the circumstances around the person were changed instead. A new title, a new country, a new regiment, a new set of expectations at this time might finally produce the effect the family needed. Victoria, who understood the machinery of monarchy better than anyone alive, believed that the right combination of title and marriage could still rescue Eddie's trajectory. She was 81 years old in 1890, and she had spent 60 years watching the dynasty absorb problems, rearrange people, and present the result to the public as continuity. The system had survived Bertha's scandals. It had survived the Republican sentiment of the 1870s. It had survived grief, war, and the slow transformation of the monarchy from a governing institution to a ceremonial one. Surely it could survive one underprepared heir. All he needed was the right wife, the right position, and enough time for the scaffolding of title and duty to harden into something that resembled substance. Edward, for his part, was less patient and less optimistic. His letters and the reports of those around him suggest a father who oscillated between irritation and reluctant affection, between the desire to shake his son into alertness and the dawning recognition that some deficiencies are not correctable by force of will. Edward knew the social world with an intimacy that Victoria, cloistered at Windsor and Balmoral, could not match. He knew how men were spoken about behind closed doors. He knew that Eddie's reputation, the languid manner, the vague eyes, the rumors that had attached themselves after Cleveland Street, was not the kind of reputation that a dukedom alone could repair. Alexandra, as always, stood on the other side of the question. She did not want Eddie repaired. She wanted him loved. Her protective instinct had only intensified as her son grew older, because the world's assessment of him grew harsher with each passing year. A child who is slow is a concern. A young man of 26 who is slow is a problem. A future king who is slow is a crisis. Alexandra could feel the judgments tightening around her son, and her response was the same as it had always been: to draw him closer, to insist on his goodness, to resist the implication that goodness was not enough. There is something about the family's position in 1890 that is worth understanding before the story moves forward. They were not by any measure that the public could see a family in crisis. The Queen was on the throne. The Prince of Wales was the most prominent social figure in Europe. The Duke of Clarence and Avondale had a title, a regiment, and a future that included the crown of the largest empire in human history. The photographs from this period show a family arranged in the ordered compositions that Victorian portraiture demanded: ranks of children and grandchildren, uniforms and gowns, the physical evidence of dynastic continuity. Nothing in those photographs suggested that anything was wrong. The image was doing its work, but the private correspondence tells a different story. The letters between Victoria, Edward, and their advisors during this period carry a persistent undertone of concern that never quite rises to alarm, but never fully subsides. What was to be done about Eddie? The questions circle through the family like a draft through an old house, always present, never quite addressed directly. Felt by everyone, but acknowledged by no one in terms that would require a definitive answer. Edward's letters to Victoria are careful in their phrasing, as all letters from son to sovereign mother must be, but the frustration shows through the formality. He worried about Eddie's listlessness. He worried about the impression Eddie made on men of affairs. He worried that the prince, if left to his own devices, would drift into a kind of decorative irrelevance that the monarchy could not afford in an age when republican sentiment, though contained, had not entirely disappeared. Victoria's responses carried the confidence of a woman who believed that the correct arrangement of marriage, title, and appointment could solve almost any problem of character. She had managed 9 children, dozens of grandchildren, and a dynasty that now spanned every major throne in Europe. She had seen difficult cases before. She had seen Bertie himself, the most wayward of her sons, eventually settle into something approaching responsibility, or at least the appearance of it. She believed the same could be achieved with Eddie, given the right wife and the right circumstances. Alexandra's voice in this private conversation was different from both. She did not write about Eddie's limitations because she did not accept the premise. Her letters speak of his kindness, his gentleness, his affection. She saw in her son the qualities that the world valued least and the mother valued most. Her position in the family debate was not strategic. It was emotional, and it was, in its own way, the most honest assessment of all, because Alexandra alone seemed to understand that Eddie might never become what the family needed him to be, and that the attempt to force him into that shape was itself a form of cruelty. The answer, when it finally came, was the one the dynasty always reached for: marriage. The courtship failures had been painful, and each one had carried its own particular sting. Alex of Hesse was Victoria's preferred candidate, a granddaughter of her own, a princess of the right age, the right rank, the right religion, and the right bloodline. The match would have kept the network tight, a cousin marrying a cousin, the family strengthening itself from within. Victoria communicated her wishes with the quiet authority of a woman who was accustomed to having her preferences treated as instructions. But Alex declined. The rejection arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a polite, firm refusal that passed through the family's private channels, with the discretion that royal disappointments required. The reasons were never fully made public. Alex may have found Eddie unappealing. She may have sensed something in his manner, the passivity, the vagueness, the quality that his own family struggled to name, that made her unwilling to bind her life to his. She may simply have preferred someone else. Whatever her reasons, the refusal wounded the family's pride and raised a question that Victoria did not wish to confront. If a woman from inside the family network could see that Eddie was not desirable, what did that say about the image the family was presenting to the world? Alex would marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia instead, and her fate, revolution, imprisonment, the cellar at Ekaterinburg, would be far more terrible than anything that awaited her in England. But in the moment of her refusal, she had simply exercised the one power that a princess in a dynastic marriage market possessed, the power to say no. Hélène of Orléans arrived in the story as something more disruptive, a woman Eddie appeared to have genuine feelings for and who appeared to have genuine feelings for him. She was French, Catholic, a daughter of the Orleanist pretender to the French throne, and she was constitutionally impossible as a bride for the man who would one day become head of the Church of England. The match was raised with Victoria, and by several accounts, Helen herself offered to convert to Anglicanism, a gesture that suggested real emotional investment. Eddie reportedly went to his grandmother and pleaded the case in person, which was itself remarkable. A young man who was routinely described as passive and disengaged had found something that moved him to act. Victoria was not unsympathetic. She wrote to the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to explore the constitutional possibilities, but the obstacles were insurmountable. The Pope would not sanction the conversion. The political establishment would not tolerate the risk. And the match was extinguished not by indifference, but by the machinery of religion and state that a prince could not override, no matter how much he might wish to. The Helen episode matters because it is one of the few moments in Eddie's recorded life where he appears to have wanted something badly enough to fight for it and where the system denied him. It is a glimpse of a person inside the managed exterior, a young man capable of attachment, capable of effort, capable of disappointment, and it deepens the tragedy of what followed because the wife he eventually accepted was not a woman he had chosen out of desire, but a woman the family had chosen out of necessity. Other names had been considered and quietly abandoned. The family needed a woman who was royal enough to satisfy the requirements of rank, practical enough to manage a difficult husband, strong enough to represent the monarchy with dignity, and willing enough to accept what marriage to Eddie had become by 1891. An assignment, a commission, a task that required specific qualities in the person undertaking it, and an understanding, never stated openly, but understood by everyone involved, that the bride's role would be as much managerial as romantic. Princess Mary of Teck met every requirement. She was the granddaughter of King George III through her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. She was intelligent, well-read, and formidably self-disciplined, qualities she had developed partly by temperament and partly by necessity. Having grown up in a household where her mother's expansive generosity far outstripped the family's income. The Tecks had lived abroad in Florence for several years during Mary's adolescence to economize, and the experience had given her a perspective that few princesses of her generation shared. She understood that royal status without financial security was a precarious thing, and that dignity required management as much as birthright. She had returned to England to live at White Lodge in Richmond Park, where she cultivated the interest in art, history, and collecting that would define her adult life. She was not beautiful in the way that Alexandra had been beautiful. She lacked that effortless Danish grace, that radiance that could light up a photograph. But she had presence, purpose, and the kind of steady, observant intelligence that the family recognized as exactly what Eddie needed. More importantly, she was willing. On December the 7th, 1891, at Luton Hoo in Bedfordshire, a grand country house set in the Hertfordshire landscape, hosting a shooting party arranged by the Danish ambassador, Prince Albert Victor proposed to Princess Mary of Teck. The setting was characteristic of how the upper reaches of Victorian society arranged its most consequential private moments. A country house, a gathering of the right people, a walk or a quiet conversation in which the words that would determine two lives were spoken away from the drawing room and the other guests. Mary accepted. The engagement was announced to the household, then to the family, then to the public, and the news was received with the warmth that royal engagements reliably produced. Newspapers reported the match approvingly. The public saw what it wanted to see. A handsome prince, a suitable princess, a wedding that promised continuity and celebration. A wedding date was set for February the 27th, 1892, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same chapel where Eddie's parents had married in 1863, the same chapel where Victoria and Albert's union had been blessed, the same chapel that served as the dynasty's ceremonial heart. The continuity was deliberate. Every detail of the wedding plan was designed to communicate stability, tradition, and the unbroken line of succession. The message was clear. The prince was settled. The future was secured. For a brief moment, perhaps the only moment of genuine public optimism in Eddie's adult life, the machinery appeared to have worked. The troublesome heir had a title, a bride, and a wedding date. The rumors of Cleveland Street were receding into the background noise of a society that preferred not to dwell on unpleasant subjects once the immediate scandal had passed. The Whitechapel murders, though unsolved, had faded from the front pages. The press had moved on to other sensations, other horrors, and the Metropolitan Police had quietly accepted that the killer would not be identified. The family could look forward to a wedding at Windsor, a marriage that would stabilize the heir, the birth of children who would extend the line, and the eventual assumption of the throne by a man who would be supported, managed, and guided by a wife whose strength compensated for his own deficiencies. It was not the fairy tale the public imagined. It was something more pragmatic and more honest, a dynasty deploying its most reliable instrument to solve its most persistent problem. And for a few weeks in December 1891, it appeared that the instrument might actually work. Mary, for her part, entered the engagement with the composure that would define her public life for the next 60 years. She was 24 years old. She had been raised to understand that royal marriages were alliances as much as romances, and she accepted the role she had been offered with a seriousness that Eddie himself could not match. Her private feelings about the engagement are difficult to reconstruct. She was not in love with Eddie in any passionate sense. The accounts that survive suggest mutual regard and the kind of comfortable affection that Victorian royal matches often produced, but she was committed. She understood what was expected, and she had the character to deliver it. George, meanwhile, occupied his usual position. The younger brother, the naval officer, the man whose life ran on a parallel track that was not supposed to intersect with the throne. He was 26 years old in 1891, and he had spent the years since the Bacchante building a career in the Royal Navy that gave him everything Eddie's managed existence could not: structure, purpose, competence, the respect of men who judged him on his seamanship rather than his birth. He had risen through the ranks with genuine merit, served on active vessels, and developed the bluff, disciplined manner that would later characterize his reign. He was fond of his elder brother. The relationship between them, by most accounts, was affectionate rather than competitive. And there is no evidence that he regarded Eddie's engagement as anything other than a family occasion to be welcomed. The idea that he might inherit Eddie's position, his place in the succession, his fiancée, his very future, was not yet thinkable. That thought belonged to a world that had not yet arrived, and George, who was a man of duty rather than ambition, would not have reached for it even if it had. But the documentary must now address a thread that runs beneath the surface of this period and would later become one of the most persistent elements of the conspiracy: the question of Eddie's health. The documented medical record is clear on the cause of death: influenza followed by pneumonia, contracted in January 1892, during the pandemic that had been sweeping Europe since 1889. That is what killed him. That is what the doctors recorded. That is what the family reported. But later writers, beginning with Dr. Thomas Stowell's 1970 article, and amplified by subsequent conspiracy theorists, introduced the idea that Eddie suffered from syphilis, and that the disease had affected his brain, and that this neurological deterioration was the hidden explanation for his behavior, his alleged violence, and the establishment's desperate need to conceal the truth. The theory was narratively powerful because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It joined sex, secrecy, disease, degeneracy, and murder in a single Victorian nightmare. It explained everything: the languid manner, the rumored sexual deviancy, the family's persistent anxiety, the alleged cover-up, the early death, with this satisfying completeness that conspiracy theories always offer and that historical evidence almost never supports. The theory also drew its power from a specifically Victorian terror. Syphilis in the 19th century was not merely a disease. It was a moral category. It was associated with sexual transgression, with the hidden underworld of prostitution and vice that respectable society simultaneously depended upon and condemned. The idea that a prince of the blood might carry syphilis suggested that the corruption of the slums had penetrated the palace itself, that the same disease circulating through the bodies of women in Whitechapel might also be circulating through the body of the man who would be king. For a society organized around the fiction that rank and virtue were inseparable, that idea was both horrifying and, for some, irresistibly attractive. The script must be explicit. The available historical record does not establish that Prince Albert Victor had syphilis. No contemporaneous medical document confirms it. No doctor who treated him during his final illness recorded it. The theory belongs to the realm of posthumous speculation, And it gained currency not because it was supported by evidence, but because it fitted the emotional architecture of the conspiracy so perfectly that people wanted it to be true. The syphilis claim should be understood as a mirror. It reflected what the late Victorian and 20th century public already believed about aristocratic men, about the gap between the polished surface and the rotting interior. It was a metaphor that people mistook for a diagnosis. What the medical record does show is that Eddie's health had been a source of concern throughout his life. He was born prematurely. He was frequently described as lacking vitality. He may have been more susceptible to illness than his robust younger brother. These facts, combined with the family's persistent anxiety about his capacities, created a medical narrative that was ambiguous enough for later writers to fill with whatever pathology their theory required. But ambiguity is not evidence. And the distance between a prince who was constitutionally fragile and a prince who was secretly syphilitic and homicidally insane is a distance that speculation alone cannot cross. What the family was actually concerned about in the final months of 1891 was not disease. It was the practical architecture of a royal future. The wedding was being planned with the elaborate precision that a ceremony at St. George's Chapel required. The guest list was being assembled, a negotiation of rank, precedent, and diplomatic significance that occupied the Lord Chamberlain's office for weeks. The question of where Eddie and Mary would live after the wedding was being debated. The question of what his public role would be, which charities, which regiments, which ceremonial duties would fill his days, occupied the attention of the Prince of Wales's private secretary and the broader network of advisors who managed the monarchy's public face. There was talk, serious and sustained, of a possible appointment as Viceroy of Ireland. The role was a deal for the family's purposes. It was ceremonial, prestigious, and visible. Exactly the kind of position that would give Eddie the appearance of authority and importance without requiring the independent judgment that more demanding posts would demand. Dublin Castle, the viceregal lodge in Phoenix Park, the social round of an Irish court. These were settings that would frame the prince in dignity and give Mary the stage she needed to manage their public life. The staff of the viceregal establishment were experienced enough to handle the practical demands of governance, which meant that Eddie's limitation would be compensated for by the institution around him. The plan had a quiet elegance that revealed the family's true understanding of the situation: a dukedom, a wife, a viceregal appointment, and enough institutional support to carry the prince through the years until the throne arrived. The prince would reign. The people around him would govern, and the public, which had no access to the private doubts that the family carried, would see only the image the machinery produced. For the first time in Eddie's life, the pieces appeared to be falling into place. The family had found a bride. The title had been conferred. The role was being shaped. The wedding was 6 weeks away. Alexandra allowed herself to feel something close to relief. Her son would be married, settled, protected by a woman whose strength complemented his gentleness. Edward permitted himself a cautious optimism that the worst might be behind them. Victoria, who had spent years pressing for exactly this outcome, could see the outline of the future she had been trying to construct since Eddie was a boy. Even George, from his position as the younger brother, could see the family's anxiety beginning to ease. The pattern appeared to be completing itself. The machinery appeared to be working. And then the future collapsed. On January the 7th, 1892, around the time of his 28th birthday, the Duke of Clarence and Avondale fell ill at Sandringham. The timing was cruel in its ordinariness. The family had gathered at Sandringham for the new year and for Eddie's birthday on January the 8th, one of the annual rituals of the Wales household, a time of shooting parties, family dinners, and the kind of domestic celebration that the Norfolk estate was designed to host. The house was full. The mood was festive. The wedding was less than 2 months away, and the preparations had lent an additional brightness to the season. Mary was staying nearby with her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Teck, who had been invited for the celebrations. George was present. The princesses were present. The household staff had prepared the rooms, laid the fires, and arranged the house for a birthday that was supposed to mark the beginning of Eddie's settled future. The illness began with a cold, a minor affliction, the kind of thing that the English winter produced routinely, and that the household's doctors would have treated with rest and warmth and the expectation of recovery within days. But the cold did not resolve. It worsened. And what was developing was not an ordinary winter chill, but influenza. The influenza pandemic of 1889 to 1892, sometimes called the Russian flu. because early reports traced it to outbreaks in St. Petersburg had been circulating through Europe for 3 years. It had killed hundreds of thousands of people across the continent and in Britain, reaching into every level of society, every household, every institution. The pandemic had already touched the royal family. Victoria herself had suffered a bout, and its capacity to kill was well understood. Influenza was not a disease that respected rank or wealth. It could be managed with rest, warmth, and medical attention, but when it developed into pneumonia, the prognosis darkened rapidly, particularly in patients whose constitutions were already fragile. The initial reports from Sandringham were not alarming. Influenza was common. Young men recovered. The family adjusted its plans. The birthday celebrations were muted, the shooting program modified, and expected that Eddie would be back on his feet within the week. But over the following days, the cold deepened into a persistent fever. The influenza took hold with a force that the household doctors could not arrest. And then pneumonia set in. The complication that turned a manageable illness into a mortal threat, filling the lungs with fluid, making each breath a labor, turning the body's own defenses into an instrument of suffocation. The household began to understand, with the slowness that is always present when the person who is ill is someone the family cannot imagine losing, that this was serious. More doctors were summoned. Medical bulletins were prepared, careful, measured statements designed to inform the public without causing alarm, the language calibrated to say enough without saying too much. The family members already at Sandringham drew closer to the sick room. Edward, Alexandra, George, the princesses Victoria and Maud. Each found their way to the wing of the house where Eddie lay, drawn by anxiety and by the instinct that family crises activate even in people who have spent years at emotional distance from one another. Mary of Teck was brought to the house from her nearby lodgings. Her parents accompanied her. The room where Eddie lay became the center of the household, and then the center of the family, and then the center of the dynasty's anxiety about its own future. The wedding invitations had already been sent. The ceremony was fixed for February the 27th. The chapel was being prepared, the dress was being made, and the groom was lying in a bedroom at Sandringham, growing weak by the day, attended by doctors who were beginning to communicate to each other, if not yet to the family, that the situation was grave. Each person in the household experienced the gathering crisis differently, and the sick room at Sandringham became a place where private fears that had been suppressed for years now gathered in the corridors and at the bedside. Edward, who had spent years frustrated by his son, who had written letters expressing concern and impatience in almost equal measure, now faced the possibility that frustration might be replaced by something far worse, by the loss of the child he had never quite known how to reach. Alexandra, whose entire emotional world was organized around her children, whose love for Eddie had always been the most uncomplicated thing in a complicated household, could feel the ground shifting beneath her in ways that no mother should have to endure. George, who was present but not yet central to the crisis, watched his brother's decline with the helpless attention of a man who could do nothing useful except be there, not yet understanding that his presence at Sandringham was the beginning of a transformation that would redirect his entire life. Mary, who had known Eddie for such a short time as a fiancée, barely a month since the proposal at Luton Hoo, sat in a house that was supposed to be preparing for her wedding and found herself instead confronting a reality she could not have anticipated and had no script for navigating. The prince drifted in and out of consciousness. The pneumonia was filling his lungs. The doctors consulted. The bulletins grew more somber. The household staff moved through the corridors of Sandringham with the hushed efficiency of people who understood that something was ending, but did not yet know what it would mean. Outside, the January weather settled over Norfolk. Gray, cold, the flat landscape stripped of color, the short days darkening early. Inside a dynasty that had spent 28 years trying to prepare, one young man for the throne was about to discover that all of its preparations had been for the wrong brother. The wedding was 6 weeks away. The prince was 28 years old. And nobody in the sick room at Sandringham, not the father, not the mother, not the brother, not the fiancé, yet understood that despair was about to become the future. The days between January the 7th and January the 14th, 1892, unfolded at Sandringham with the particular cruelty that illness inflicts on the people who can only watch. The household had entered a kind of suspended time. The ordinary rhythms of the estate, the shooting, the meals at fixed hours, the household staff moving through their routines with the practiced efficiency of a great house in winter, continued around the edges of the crisis, because a house of that size does not stop functioning simply because one person inside it is dying. The fires were still laid, the kitchen still prepared food, the horses were still exercised in the paddock. The post still arrived, carrying letters of congratulation on the engagement that were now painful to open. The wedding presents that had begun to arrive at Sandringham, silver, porcelain, the gifts that society sent to mark a royal union, accumulated in rooms that no one had the heart to enter. But the center of gravity had shifted entirely to the bedroom where the Duke of Clarence and Avondale lay, and everything that happened outside that room now felt peripheral, muffled, slightly unreal, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The first days of the illness had not caused serious alarm. Eddie had fallen ill around his birthday, and the household treated the cold as a nuisance rather than a crisis. He was young. He was being attended by the best doctors available. Influenza was common. The expectation was that rest and warmth would resolve the matter within days, and that the birthday celebrations and the wedding preparations would continue with only a minor delay. But by the 9th or 10th of January, the tone had changed. The cold had not lifted. The fever had risen. The influenza had taken hold with a persistence that the doctors could not arrest, and the first signs of pneumonia were beginning to appear. A heaviness in the chest, a roughness in the breathing. The body struggled to draw air into lungs that were filling with fluid. Eddie's condition deteriorated in stages that the doctors tracked with increasing concern, and the family absorbed with increasing dread. His breathing grew labored, then shallow, then irregular. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to recognize the people at his bedside and to speak to them with the gentle manner that had always been his most consistent quality, sometimes lost in the delirium that high fever produces, calling out names, speaking fragments of sentences that those present strained to hear and later struggled to interpret. One widely reported account describes him as calling out during his delirium for Helene, the woman he had loved and lost, not the woman he was about to marry. Whether this detail is precisely true is impossible to verify at this distance, but it has survived in the retellings because it captures something essential about Eddie's life. Even at the end, the person inside the managed exterior was reaching for something the machinery had denied him. The doctors did what late Victorian medicine allowed them to do, which was not very much. They could monitor the fever. They could administer what remedies existed: quinine, brandy, poultices, the limited pharmacopoeia of an era that understood infection imperfectly and could not treat it with the tools that the 20th century would provide. They could keep the room warm, the patient still, the air as clean as the Norfolk winter allowed. They could communicate with each other in the careful technical language of men who knew they were losing a patient, but whose professional duty required them to maintain hope as long as hope was remotely plausible. They could not stop what was happening inside Eddie's lungs. The Prince of Wales's chaplain was summoned to Sandringham. In a household governed by the rhythms of the Church of England, the arrival of a clergyman to read prayers for the dying was not a formality. It was a signal, the gravest signal the household could send without issuing a public statement. It told the family, in language that required no medical expertise to understand, that the doctors had communicated their assessment and the household was preparing for the end. The chaplain's presence at the bedside during those final days transformed the sick room from a place of treatment into a place of vigil. And the prayers he read, the ancient words of the Anglican rite, spoken in the warmth of a Norfolk bedroom while winter pressed against the windows, gave the gathering its final irrevocable shape. Edward stood in the room as a father first and an heir to the throne second. And for the first time in years, those two identities were not in conflict. He had spent the better part of a decade frustrated by Eddie, by his passivity, his vagueness, his inability to become the man the dynasty required. He had written letters expressing that frustration. He had pushed for remedies, appointments, marriages, anything that might rouse his son into the force of character that seemed to come so naturally to George. And now the son he had spent years trying to improve was slipping away, and none of those criticisms mattered any longer. What remained in the room was simpler and older than any dynastic calculation: a father watching his child die. Alexandra's grief was already beginning before the death itself. She had spent Eddie's entire life protecting him from judgment, from exposure, from the family's own anxiety about his limitations. And now she could not protect him from the thing that no mother's love can deflect. She sat at his bedside, she held his hand. She spoke to him in the language of a mother who has loved a child not for what he might become, but for what he was. The accounts that survive from those present describe her composure as extraordinary, and her suffering as visible to everyone who saw her face. She did not collapse. She did not leave the room. She remained because remaining was the only thing left that she could do for him. George was in the room or near it throughout those final days. He was 26 years old, a naval officer, a younger brother whose place in the world had always been defined by its distance from the throne. He had loved Eddie, not with the complicated, anxious love of a parent, but with the straightforward affection of a brother who had shared a childhood, a ship, a schoolroom, and a set of expectations that had shaped them both, though in opposite directions. George had been the capable one, the reliable one, the one who did not require management. And now, standing in the corridors of Sandringham while doctors moved between consultations and the household held its collective breath, he occupied a position that was both intimate and terrible. He was watching his brother die, and he could not yet fully comprehend that the death would not merely take Eddie from him, but would place him, George, in the direct line of succession to the throne. That understanding would come later. In the sick room, it was not yet the future that consumed people's attention. It was the present. The sound of Eddie's breathing, the heat of his skin, the occasional moments of lucidity that gave the family hope, and the longer stretches of delirium that took it away again. Mary of Teck occupied perhaps the most ambiguous position of anyone at Sandringham. She had been engaged to Eddie for barely 5 weeks. She had known him for longer, of course. They had met at family gatherings. They had been introduced and assessed and approved through the careful machinery of dynastic matchmaking. But her experience of him as a fiancé, as the man she was supposed to marry in 6 weeks' time, was measured in days rather than years. She did not have the depth of private knowledge that a long courtship might have produced. She did not have the emotional reserves that come from years of shared experience. She had a commitment, a duty, a ring, and a wedding date that was becoming, with each passing hour, less likely to be kept. She sat in the house, she visited the sick room, she waited, and the composure she showed, noted by those around her, was the first public demonstration of the quality that would define her for the next 6 decades: the ability to endure what could not be changed with dignity, silence, and an iron self possession that concealed whatever raged beneath. The princesses, Victoria and Maud, Eddie's sisters, were present too. Their grief was quieter, less documented, overshadowed in the historical record by the larger characters of father, mother, brother, and fiancé. But they were there. They had grown up with Eddie at Sandringham and Marlborough House. They had known him as the gentle, agreeable elder brother who was always slightly out of step with the world the family inhabited. Their loss, when it came, would be private and lasting. Mary of Teck's parents, the Duke and Duchess of Teck, were also at Sandringham, invited for the wedding celebrations that were now dissolving into a death watch. The Duchess of Teck, Mary Adelaide, was a woman of enormous warmth and generosity, and her presence in the house added another layer of emotional complexity to a situation that was already almost unbearably crowded with grief. On January the 13th, the medical bulletins grew unmistakably grave. The pneumonia had not responded to treatment, the prince's strength was failing, his periods of consciousness were shorter, his breathing was more labored. The household understood, everyone understood, from the doctors to the servants who carried trays to the corridor outside the sick room, that the end was approaching. The corridors of Sandringham, which had been dressed for a birthday and a season of celebration, now carried the atmosphere of a vigil. The servants moved quietly, the doors were kept closed, the lamps were turned low. The January darkness outside the windows pressed against the house like a weight, the flat Norfolk landscape offering no horizon, no perspective, no distraction from what was happening inside. That night, the family gathered, not in a formal sense. There was no announcement, no summoning, but in the way that families instinctively gather when they understand that time is running short. Edward and Alexandra were at the bedside. George was close. Victoria and Maud were nearby. Mary of Teck and her parents were in the house. The chaplain continued his prayers, the doctors made their rounds, and the household settled into the final hours with the exhausted, alert stillness of people who have been waiting for days and know that the waiting is almost over. And then, on the morning of January the 14th, 1892, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Earl of Athlone, second in line to the throne of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, died. He was 28 years old. He had been ill for 7 days. His wedding was 44 days away. His fiancée was in the house. His parents were at his bedside. His brother was nearby. His sisters were present. The Prince of Wales's chaplain had read the prayers for the dying. The doctors had done what their era permitted. The household had kept its vigil through the Norfolk night, and the young man who had spent his entire life being prepared, assessed, managed, protected, corrected, and quietly doubted, the young man who had never been allowed to discover who he might have been without the weight of the crown pressing down on him, was gone. The cause of death was pneumonia following influenza. That is what the medical record states. That is what was communicated to the public. That is what the evidence supports. He died of a disease that was killing people across Europe in their thousands, a disease that did not care about rank or title or the plans that a dynasty had made for the body it was consuming. The room at Sandringham fell into the silence that follows death, a silence that is different from any other kind because it contains not only the absence of the person who has died, but the sudden, overwhelming presence of everything that will now have to change. The clocks in the house continued. The fires continued. The January morning outside the windows was gray and cold and indifferent. And inside, a family that had spent 28 years arranging a young man's life around the requirements of a throne was confronted by the one event that no amount of arrangement could prevent or manage or undo. For a few minutes, or perhaps longer, the family was simply a family in grief. A mother who had lost a son, a father who had lost an heir, a brother who had lost a companion, a fiancé who had lost a future she had barely begun to inhabit. Before the world rushed in, before the bulletins were issued and the telegrams dispatched and the newspapers informed and the machinery of public mourning set in motion, there was a moment of private devastation that belonged to no one but the people in that room. The monarchy would resume. The succession would continue. The institution would survive as it always survived. But in that room, in that silence, there was only loss. Alexandra's response, in the hours and days that followed, would become part of the family's private mythology. She did not leave the room easily. She did not release her son's body to the undertakers without resistance. The grief that took hold of her in those hours at Sandringham would never fully release its grip. Later accounts describe how she preserved the room where Eddie died, his personal belongings maintained, the space kept as a kind of memorial, a place suspended in the moment of loss. Whether this detail has been embellished by lighter retellings is difficult to establish with certainty. What is not in dispute is that Alexandra's grief for Eddie was profound, enduring, and consuming in a way that her grief for no other person, not even her husband, years later, would match. She had lost a child she had spent 28 years protecting, and the protection had not been enough. Edward's grief took a different form, quieter in some ways, more complicated in others. He had been a difficult father to Eddie. He had been impatient with his son's passivity, critical of his languid manner, frustrated by qualities he could not understand and could not correct. He had written letters to Victoria expressing concern about Eddie's future. He had pushed for remedies, more travel, more military discipline, a suitable wife, with the restless energy of a man who believed that the right application of force could solve any problem of character. And now, the son he had spent years trying to improve was dead at 28, and none of those criticisms mattered any longer. They could not be taken back. They could not be explained. They could not be softened by the subsequent years of relationship that might, in time, have replaced frustration with understanding. What remained was the particular anguish of a parent who realizes, too late, that the time spent trying to change a child might have been better spent knowing one. Edward's remorse, noted by those close to him in the weeks and months after the death, was real and lasting. It did not redeem the years of pressure and disappointment, but it was real. He had wanted Eddie to be different. Now Eddie was gone, and the difference no longer mattered. What mattered was the absence, the chair unfilled, the room preserved, the son who would never have the chance to surprise his father. George's grief was compounded by something he could not yet fully articulate, but was beginning to fill with a physical weight, the awareness that his brother's death had altered his own life irrevocably. He was no longer the spare. He was no longer the younger brother whose naval career ran on a comfortable parallel track to the succession, free from the obligations and the scrutiny that the heir endured. He was now the heir presumptive to the throne of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, separated from the crown by only his father's life. Everything he had been, the naval officer, the second son, the man who was not required to be king, the man who had found in the discipline of the sea a purpose that fitted him perfectly, was dissolving in the same Sandringham bedroom where his brother's body lay cooling under the covers. George did not want the throne. He had not been prepared for it. He had been prepared for command at sea, for the structured and comprehensible world of a warship where orders were clear and duty was defined. The throne was Eddie's burden, Eddie's inheritance, Eddie's problem. And now Eddie was dead, and the burden had nowhere else to go but onto the shoulders of the brother who had never expected to carry it. Mary's composure held. It would hold for the rest of her life, through decades of public duty, through a marriage to a different brother, through a coronation she had not expected, through 2 world wars, through the abdication of a grandson. The woman who sat at Sandringham in January 1892 and watched her first intended future disintegrate was the same woman who would year after year, decade after decade, demonstrate the capacity to absorb what could not be prevented and continue. She was 24 years old. She had been a fiancée for 38 days. She was now something else, a woman released from one commitment and not yet bound to another, suspended in the strange social limbo that a broken engagement by death produces. The public response was immediate and in its way overwhelming. The news of the Duke of Clarence's death reached the country through the telegraph wires and the morning newspapers, and it was received across Britain with an outpouring of grief that reflected both genuine sympathy and the Victorian public's deep emotional investment in the royal family. This was a monarchy that had trained its subjects to feel the family's sorrows as their own, and the training held. Shops closed their shutters. Church bells tolled in parishes from London to the Scottish Highlands. Black crape appeared in windows. The penny papers published memorial edition with portraits of the prince in uniform, the same portraits that had presented him as the embodiment of imperial promise. The illustrated press devoted full pages to the death scene, imagined in the sentimental style of the era. The stricken family gathered around the bed, the young prince at peace, the chaplain with bowed head. The public did not know what the family knew. The public did not know about the tutor's reports, the languid manner, the difficulty with reading, the family's years of private anxiety about whether this particular heir could bear the weight of the crown. The public did not know about Cleveland Street, or at least not about the whispers that had connected the prince to that address. The public saw what the family had always ensured they would see: the image, the uniform, the portrait, the promise. And so the public mourned not the complicated, limited, enigmatic young man who had actually lived and died, but the handsome prince of their imagination, the lost king who would have been, the future that was stolen by illness, the fairy tale interrupted. The funeral was held on January the 20th, 1892, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same chapel where Eddie's wedding was to have taken place 5 weeks later. The cruel symmetry of this detail was noted by the press and felt by the family with a force that required no commentary. The same aisle, the same altar, the same stone floor, the same windows filtering the January light. Everything was the same except the occasion, which had been transformed from the celebration of a beginning into the marking of an end. The mourners included the Prince and Princess of Wales, Prince George, the princesses, Mary of Teck and her parents, members of the extended royal family drawn from across Europe, representatives of the dynasties connected by blood and marriage to Victoria's network, the political and military establishment of the United Kingdom, and dignitaries whose presence was required by protocol and precedent. The service was conducted with the somber grandeur that the Church of England brought to royal funerals. The hymns chosen for their restraint, the prayers spoken with the measured cadence of the Anglican rite, the committal words that returned the body to the earth and the soul to God. Queen Victoria, who was at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, did not attend. Her age and health made the journey inadvisable, but she was informed of every detail, and her grief, expressed in her journal and in letters to those around her, was genuine and acute. She had lost a grandson. The dynasty had lost its plan. Eddie was interred in the Albert Memorial Chapel at Windsor, his tomb later marked by an elaborate memorial sculpted by Alfred Gilbert, a monument of white marble, bronze, and aluminium that depicted the prince in repose, surrounded by figures of angels and saints, his effigy serene and beautiful, in the idealized style that Victorian funerary art preferred. The memorial, like the portraits and the uniforms, preserved the image. It said nothing about the person behind it. The immediate machinery of succession began almost before the grief had settled, because monarchy does not pause for mourning. Within the family, the conversation that no one wished to have was already beginning. George must be prepared. George must be brought into the line of succession, not merely as a name on a constitutional list, but as a functioning heir. educated in constitutional matters, introduced to the political world, given the social and administrative and diplomatic training that Eddie's death had made urgently necessary. The work of decades, the tutors, the Bacchante, Cambridge, the regiments, the titles, that had been invested in the elder brother would now have to be compressed and redirected towards the younger one. And the terrible irony was that George, who had never been designed for the role, was far better suited to it than Eddie had ever been. George's naval career, the career he loved and had built with genuine competence over 15 years, would have to end. The Admiralty would release him. The sea, which had been his home and his purpose since he was 13 years old on the Britannia, was no longer available to him. He would be created Duke of York in May 1892, given an establishment, assigned duties, and drawn into the orbit of the throne with a speed that reflected the family's awareness that time was precious and heirs could be lost without warning. George accepted this, because George was, above all things, a man of duty, and duty left no room for what he might have preferred. But the loss of the naval life marked him. He would carry the habits of a ship's captain into his reign, the love of punctuality, the insistence on routine, the discomfort with ambiguity, and those habits would be both his strength and his limitation. And there was another conversation, one that could not yet be spoken aloud, but that moved through the family's private calculations, with the inevitability of a tide. Mary of Teck. She had been chosen for Eddie because she possessed the qualities the family needed in a future queen: intelligence, discipline, steadiness, strength, the ability to manage a household and a public role with the kind of steady competence that compensated for weakness in a husband. Those qualities had not changed with Eddie's death. The family's need for them had not diminished. If anything, the need had intensified, because the succession now rested on George alone, and George's future wife would need to be exceptional. The only thing that had changed was the brother who would benefit from those qualities. That conversation would take time. It would require delicacy, the passage of a decent interval of mourning, and the careful management of appearances that the dynasty had perfected over generations. It could not be rushed, because the public was still mourning Eddie, and the spectacle of his fiancée being transferred to his brother within weeks or months would have struck even the most deferential Victorian public as callous. But the logic was already visible to anyone who understood how the monarchy worked. The family had identified the right woman. The right woman was still unmarried, and the institution needed her. Victoria understood this with the clarity of a woman who had spent 6 decades arranging marriages. Edward understood it with the pragmatism of a man who had watched the family absorb crises before. Alexandra, lost in her grief, submerged in the mourning that would define the rest of her emotional life, may not yet have been ready to contemplate it. George, who was still absorbing the fact that his brother was dead and that his own life had been permanently altered by that death, was not yet in a position to think about marriage to anyone, let alone to the woman who had been engaged to Eddie 5 weeks earlier. And Mary herself, composed and watchful in private, gave no public indication of what she thought about any of it. But the machinery was already in motion. It always was. The monarchy survived not because its members were exceptional. Some were not. And Eddie's life had demonstrated the consequences when they were not. But because the institution was designed to continue regardless of who was lost. A prince died. A brother stepped forward. A fiancé was gently, carefully, eventually redirected. And the public, which had mourned the death with genuine feeling, would in time celebrate the wedding with genuine joy, never quite understanding the extraordinary act of institutional pragmatism that connected the two events. The prince was dead. The chapel that was to have hosted his wedding had hosted his funeral instead. The brother who was not supposed to be king was now the only candidate. The woman who was not supposed to marry him was, quietly and as yet unspoken, the obvious choice. And the family that had spent 28 years trying to make Eddie fit a role he could not fill now turned its attention, with the same relentless efficiency, to making George fill it instead. But there is one more thing that Eddie's death accomplished, and it is the thing that matters most to this story. It made him permanently unknowable. Had he lived, he would have become either a competent king, a disastrous king, or something muddled and uncertain in between. He would have accumulated a record, decisions, speeches, relationships, failures, successes, that would have defined him in the way that historical records define every other monarch. Instead, he died at 28, with no reign, no marriage, no children, and no public record beyond the managed images the family had produced. He became a blank space, handsome in photographs, difficult in private memoirs, rumored in scandals, and available, permanently, irresistibly available, for reinvention by anyone who wished to fill the silence with their own story. Nearly 80 years later, a retired surgeon would publish an article about Jack the Ripper in a London journal. He would not name Prince Albert Victor directly. He would describe an unnamed patient, a royal figure, a man whose medical history supposedly pointed to a terrible secret, and almost everyone who read the article would know exactly who he meant. The monarchy moved on, because the monarchy always moved on. That was the point of it. The institutional logic that made it survive where individual lives could not. A prince died, and the institution absorbed the death, rearranged its personnel, and continued. George was created Duke of York on May the 24th, 1892, 4 months after his brother's death, the same date on which Eddie had been created Duke of Clarence in Avondale 2 years earlier. The symmetry was deliberate or coincidental or both. With the monarchy, it was sometimes difficult to tell. The new title marked the formal beginning of George's transformation from naval officer to heir. He was given an establishment, a household, a program of constitutional and political education, and the attention of the advisors and private secretaries, whose task it was to prepare heirs for the work that the throne demanded. George submitted to this preparation with the same dutiful compliance he had brought to everything in his life, not with enthusiasm, not with the restless appetite for public life that his father had always shown, but with the steady, uncomplaining acceptance of a man who understood that duty did not require enjoyment. It only required performance. The question of Mary was handled with the delicacy the situation demanded. A decent interval of mourning was observed. The public was allowed to grieve for Eddie and to forget gradually that his fiancée was still unmarried and still royal and still in possession of every quality the family had identified when they selected her in the first place. Behind the scenes, the conversations that had been unthinkable in January became possible by spring and practical by autumn. George and Mary were brought together. At family gatherings, at court occasions, in the controlled social settings where the monarchy arranged its most consequential private decisions. Whether genuine affection developed between them during this period, or whether both simply understood and accepted the institutional logic of the match, is impossible to determine with certainty from the outside. What is known is that George proposed to Mary of Teck on May the 3rd, 1893, 16 months after Eddie's death, and she accepted. They were married on July the 6th, 1893, at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. The wedding was a public celebration, received with the warmth and spectacle that a royal marriage commanded. The press covered it with approval. The public attended with enthusiasm. If anyone in the crowd outside the chapel paused to consider the extraordinary circumstances, that the bride had been engaged to the groom's dead brother 18 months earlier, that she had watched her first intended future collapse in a Norfolk sick room, that she was now standing at an altar with a man she had not originally been chosen for. They kept those reflections to themselves. The monarchy had presented the marriage as continuity, and the public accepted the presentation. Mary carried herself through the ceremony with the composure that had become her defining quality, the same composure she had shown at Sandringham during Eddie's illness, the same composure she would show through decades of public duty, through a coronation, through 2 world wars, through the abdication of a grandson. If she felt the strangeness of her position, she gave no sign of it. Mary had learned, perhaps earlier than most people ever learn, that survival in the world she inhabited required the capacity to absorb what could not be changed, and to move forward without looking back. George and Mary's marriage would prove to be one of the most stable and enduring royal unions of the modern era, though stability was not the same thing as warmth. They were not by any account a passionate couple. George was bluff, disciplined, uncomfortable with emotional display, a man who preferred routine to spontaneity and duty to pleasure. He rose at the same hour each day. He expected his household to run with the regularity of a ship. He shot. He collected stamps. He kept meticulous records of the birds he killed and the weather he observed. His emotional life was private and constrained, and the distance between himself and his children, particularly his eldest sons, would become one of the defining features of the next generation's unhappiness. Mary was reserved, formal, devoted to duty, and possessed of an inner authority that her husband instinctively respected and that his courtiers sometimes feared. She was a collector of art and antiques, a woman whose taste and acquisitiveness became legendary. She was not a warm mother in the demonstrative way that Alexandra had been, but she was present, she was committed, and she brought to the marriage the same qualities the family had identified when they first chose her for Eddie: intelligence, discipline, steadiness, and the ability to manage a household and a public role with unwavering competence. Together they had 6 children. Their eldest son, Edward, would become king and abdicate for Wallace Simpson in 1936, another heir whose private desires could not survive the requirements of the crown, another echo of the pattern that had defined Eddie's life. Their second son, Albert, would become George VI and lead the country through the Second World War with a courage that his stammer and his shyness had given no one reason to expect. Their daughter, Mary, became the Princess Royal. Their youngest son, John, suffered from epilepsy and was raised quietly away from public life, another royal child whose limitations were managed through distance and silence, another echo of the family's instinct to protect by concealing. The line that was supposed to pass through Eddie passed through George instead, and it produced the modern British monarchy. Edward, Prince of Wales, outlived his eldest son by 9 years and his mother by 9 more. He carried the grief of Eddie's death in the way that Victorian men of his class and generation carried grief, privately, intermittently, expressed in occasional remarks to those closest to him, but never permitted to disrupt the public performance of duty and pleasure that defined his life. He continued his social rounds, his racing, his diplomatic relationships, his friendships with women whose names polite society knew but did not publicly discuss. The machinery of his world had absorbed the loss and continued. Victoria died at Osborne House on January the 22nd, 1901, at the age of 81, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having reigned for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. Her death ended an era so completely that the era bore her name. The world she left behind, the world of empire, of European monarchies connected by blood and marriage, of the social code that demanded propriety above all else, would be shattered within 15 years by a war that destroyed 4 empires and killed millions. But in January 1901, none of that was yet visible. What was visible was a new king, Edward VII, the son Victoria had distrusted and doubted for decades, finally inheriting the role he had been born to and had waited nearly 60 years to assume. Edward's reign lasted 9 years, from 1901 to 1910, and it was characterized by the social and diplomatic energy that had always defined him. He was 60 when he became king, and he brought to the throne the skills of a lifetime spent navigating society, cultivating relationships, and performing the role of prince with a charm and ease that Eddie had never possessed and never could have possessed. He modernized the monarchy's public face. He cultivated the entente cordiale with France. He entertained with a generosity and a style that made the court at Buckingham Palace the social center of Edwardian England. His private life continued as it always had. Alice Keppel, his long-standing mistress, remained a constant presence. And the public, which had learned to accept his appetites as part of the package, did not object. He died on May the 6th, 1910, at Buckingham Palace. Alice Keppel was brought to his deathbed. Alexandra, who had endured a lifetime of her husband's infidelities with a grace that concealed the pain it caused, reportedly allowed the visit. The crown passed to George. Alexandra survived them all. She survived Eddie, whose death had been the defining wound of her life. She survived Edward, whose betrayal she had absorbed with the quiet dignity that her class and generation demanded of wives. She survived Victoria, whose authority had governed the family for 6 decades. She lived on at Sandringham, in the house where Eddie had died, surrounded by the objects and the memories that she maintained with a devotion that the family sometimes found difficult to witness. She was increasingly deaf. The condition that had begun in her 30s had progressed until the world outside her immediate circle was largely inaccessible to her. She was increasingly isolated, a figure from another age living in a world that was moving beyond her comprehension at a speed that no amount of royal privilege could slow. She died on November the 20th, 1925, at Sandringham at the age of 80. She had outlived her eldest son by 33 years. She had lived long enough to see the world transformed by the Great War, by revolution, by the collapse of every European dynasty she had been connected to by birth and marriage. The Romanovs were gone, murdered in the cellar at Ekaterinburg in 1918, including Alex of Hesse, the woman who had rejected Eddie and married the Tsar instead. The Habsburgs were gone. The Hohenzollerns were gone. The Ottoman dynasty was gone. The British monarchy alone had survived, and it had survived in part because of the quality that Alexandra herself had embodied more than anyone: the capacity to endure loss and continue. George V became king in 1910 and reigned for 25 years through some of the most turbulent decades in British history. He led the country through the First World War, maintaining the monarchy's position through a conflict that destroyed the empires of his cousins in Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. He navigated the post-war transformation of the British Empire, the rise of the labor movement, the general strike of 1926, and the social upheavals that remade the class structure of the nation his grandmother had ruled with such unquestioned authority. He was not a brilliant man. He was not a charismatic man. He was a dutiful man who had been trained for the Navy and who ran his kingdom with the same regularity and insistence on procedure that he had brought to his ships. And he was, in the end, exactly the king the country needed: steady where Eddie would have been uncertain, reliable where Eddie would have been vulnerable, present where Eddie might have been absent. In 1917, in the midst of the war against Germany, George made the decision that completed the dynasty's reinvention. He changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, the German name that Prince Albert had brought to the British throne in 1840, the name that had been carried by every member of the family since Victoria's marriage, the name that connected the British monarchy to its German origins, was discarded overnight in favor of an English name drawn from the castle that had been the monarchy's seat for centuries. The renaming was an act of political survival, a recognition that a dynasty with a German name could not credibly lead a nation at war with Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II reportedly joked that he was looking forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The joke was appreciated. The name was changed, and with it, the last visible thread connecting the modern monarchy to the family that had produced Albert Victor was severed. The Saxe-Coburg-Gothas became the Windsors. The past was officially behind them. Mary became Queen Mary, no longer the woman who had been engaged to Eddie, but the woman who had married George, who had borne his children, who had presided over the court with a formality and an authority that made her one of the most respected and most formidable consorts of the 20th century. She was a collector on a grand scale, of art, of jade, of Fabergé, of anything that caught her eye in the houses she visited, sometimes with an acquisitiveness that her hosts found alarming. She was a disciplinarian whose expectations of her household and her family were exacting and inflexible. She was not a warm mother in the modern sense, and her eldest son's decision to abdicate in 1936 for Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, caused her a pain and a fury that she never fully recovered from. The abdication was, in its way, another echo of the pattern: an heir whose private desires could not coexist with the demands of the crown, another prince who could not be made to fit the role the dynasty required. Mary had seen the pattern before. She had been recruited to solve it, and she had spent 40 years believing it was solved, only to watch it repeat itself in her own eldest son. She outlived George, who died in January 1936. She endured the abdication crisis of that same year with the public composure she had perfected over a lifetime. She lived through the Second World War, through the Blitz, through the transformation of the world she had been born into. She lived to see her granddaughter Elizabeth become queen upon the death of George VI in February 1952, and she died on March the 24th, 1953, at Marlborough House in London at the age of 85, 10 weeks before Elizabeth's coronation at Westminster Abbey. She had been a fiancée, a grieving almost widow, a second fiancée, a duchess, a princess, a queen consort, a dowager queen, and a grandmother. She had been the dynasty's answer twice, once for Eddie, once for George, and she had delivered both times. Eddie's branch of the dynasty ended where it began, at Sandringham in winter, with a death that left no descendants and no record beyond the managed images the family had produced. He had no children, he had no wife, he had no reign, he had no speeches, no decisions, no public record that might have defined him independently of the family that had shaped him. He existed in portraits, in memorial sculptures, in the court circular, and in the silence that his family maintained around his private limitations. That silence, which had been designed to protect him, became the space into which other men would eventually pour their fantasies. The first of those men was Dr. Thomas Stowell. In November 1970, Stowell published an article in The Criminologist, a small specialized journal with a limited circulation that was not normally the venue for national controversy, suggesting that Jack the Ripper had been a man of high social standing whose identity was known to certain members of the medical establishment, but had been concealed for reasons of discretion and propriety. Stowell did not name Prince Albert Victor directly. He described an unnamed patient, referred to as S, whose medical history supposedly involves syphilis, contracted during a youthful indiscretion, progressive mental deterioration, and a connection to Sir William Gall, physician in ordinary to Queen Victoria. The article was carefully constructed to imply without stating, to suggest without accusing, to lead the reader to a conclusion that the author could technically deny having drawn. But the implication was unmistakable, and the press identified the subject almost immediately. The coded language fooled no one. The reaction was swift and considerable. Newspapers ran the story, television programs discussed it. The public, whose appetite for Jack the Ripper theories had never diminished in the 82 years since the Whitechapel murders, consumed the new theory with the eagerness that the subject always generated. For the first time, the Royal Ripper connection had been presented not as gossip or rumor, but as a medical theory offered by a professional man with apparent access to privileged information. The theory had the patina of respectability, and that patina made it dangerous. Stowell, apparently alarmed by the scale and nature of the attention his article had attracted, wrote a letter to the Times denying that he had accused the Duke of Clarence of being Jack the Ripper. The denial was unconvincing. The article had been written to be read in exactly the way it had been read, but it introduced a note of confusion that would become characteristic of the entire afterlife of the theory. Assertion followed by retraction, implication followed by denial. The story advancing and retreating in a way that made it impossible to pin down and equally impossible to dismiss. Stowell died shortly afterwards. In November 1970, within days of the letter's publication, he was 85 years old. His death, coming so soon after the controversy, inevitably generated speculation among those already inclined to see conspiracy in every coincidence. His son, reported to have read through his father's papers after the death, burned them, stating, with what must have been a mixture of exhaustion and exasperation, that he had found nothing of importance. That single detail, the burning of the papers, in one of the most revealing moments in the entire afterlife of the Ripper case. It is not proof of a cover-up. It is not evidence of guilt. It is simply a son destroying his dead father's documents after concluding they were of no value. But in the world of conspiracy, where the absence of evidence is itself treated as evidence, the act of burning became something else entirely. It became the moment where the gap between what was known and what was imagined widened into a chasm. If the papers were unimportant, why burn them? If they were important, what did they contain? The questions answered themselves in the minds of those who had already decided what the answers must be. 6 years later, Stephen Knight published Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, and the theory reached its most elaborate and commercially powerful form. Knight's book presented a narrative of extraordinary scope, a secret marriage between Prince Albert Victor and a Catholic commoner named Annie Crook, an illegitimate child, a Masonic conspiracy organized by Sir William Gall, the royal physician, to silence the women of Whitechapel who knew the secret, a coachman named John Netley, who drove the murder coach, and the artist Walter Sickert as a witness and reluctant participant. The theory was built on the testimony of Joseph Gorman, who claimed to be Sickert's illegitimate son and to have inherited the story from him. The theory was cinematic. It was detailed. It was satisfying in the way that the best conspiracy theories are satisfying. Every loose end tied, every question answered, every coincidence explained. And it was riddled with factual problems. Dates did not match. Annie Crook's real biography contradicted the story. Gull had suffered a severe stroke that made the physical demands of the alleged murders implausible. The Masonic elements were unsupported, and Gorman himself, years later, admitted that the entire story was a hoax. He had invented it. The central source of the most influential Ripper royal conspiracy of the 20th century told the world, eventually, that he had made it up. But by then it was too late. The theory had entered the culture. It had become the premise of films, Murder by Decree in 1979, starring Christopher Plummer and James Mason, which transposed the royal conspiracy into a Sherlock Holmes framework. It had become the basis of Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's graphic novel From Hell, published between 1989 and 1998, which used the Knight theory as a launching point for a dense, elusive meditation on Victorian society, class, violence, and the architecture of power. and it had become the foundation of the 2001 film adaptation of From Hell, starring Johnny Depp, which brought the royal Masonic conspiracy theory to a global audience of millions. Each adaptation simplified the theory further. Each made it more vivid, more visual, more persuasive to an audience that was not reading footnotes but watching a story unfold on screen. The cultural afterlife of the theory mattered because it demonstrated something that the historical evidence alone could not: the power of narrative over truth. The facts said that Eddie was not in London during the key murders. The facts said that the police never suspected him. The facts said that the central source for the most elaborate version of the conspiracy admitted it was a fabrication. But the story survived, not because the facts supported it, but because it answered a need that the facts could not. The need to believe that the powerful were guilty, the need to believe that silence meant complicity, the need to believe that the same society that had abandoned the women of Whitechapel to poverty and violence was also capable of murdering them to protect a throne. What remains of Prince Albert Victor today is divided between the historical record and the mythology that has grown around it, and the distance between those two things has become one of the defining features of his posthumous existence. In the historical record, he is a minor royal figure. The Duke of Clarence in Avondale, born prematurely at Frogmore House in 1864, educated without distinction at Dartmouth and Cambridge, commissioned in the 10th Hussars, created a duke in 1890, engaged briefly and fatally in 1891, and dead of pneumonia at Sandringham at the age of 28. His tomb in the Albert Memorial Chapel at Windsor, the elaborate marble and bronze effigy sculpted by Alfred Gilbert, is visited by tourists who may or may not know his name and who almost certainly know the accusation attached to it. His portraits hang in the National Portrait Gallery and in the Royal Collection, the face of a young man who looks like a prince and reveals nothing of the person behind the uniform. He is a footnote in the story of George V, the heir who did not become king so that his brother could, the man whose death rearranged the dynasty. In the mythology, he is something else entirely. He is the royal suspect, the face that appears in television documentaries and paperback covers and true crime podcasts whenever the question of Jack the Ripper's identity is raised. He is the prince who might have been a monster, the heir whose secret the establishment would kill to protect, the figure at the center of a conspiracy that has survived every debunking, every retraction, every admission of fabrication, because it was never really about evidence in the first place. It was about what people needed the story to mean. It was about the conviction, formed by Cleveland Street, reinforced by a century of royal secrecy, confirmed by every subsequent scandal in which powerful institutions were shown to have protected powerful men, that the gap between the public version and the private truth was large enough to contain anything, including murder. The women of Whitechapel remain named: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were real women who lived real lives in real poverty and died real deaths in a part of London that the Victorian establishment preferred to ignore. Their murders were committed by someone whose identity has never been established with certainty, and the reduction of their stories to supporting roles in a royal conspiracy does them a disservice that modern historians, Hallie Rubenhold among them, have worked to correct. They deserve to be remembered not as the victims of a prince who almost certainly never harmed them, but as individuals whose lives and deaths exposed the brutality of a society that treated poverty as a moral failing and treated women in poverty as barely visible at all. Cleveland Street remains the real scandal closest to Eddie's world, not because it proves he was a client of a male brothel in Fitzrovia, which it does not, but because it proves beyond any reasonable dispute that the Victorian establishment was willing and able to protect men of rank from the consequences of their private behavior. The telegraph boys were convicted and imprisoned. Lord Arthur Somerset was allowed to flee the country. The journalist who asked uncomfortable questions went to jail for criminal libel. The system worked as designed. It shielded the powerful and disciplined those who questioned the shielding. That is not conspiracy theory. That is the documented historical record. And it is the record that made every subsequent conspiracy theory about the royal family, including the Ripper accusation, emotionally plausible, whether the specific claims were true or not. Cleveland Street did not prove that the monarchy could commit murder. It proved that the machinery of protection existed, and that was enough. George and Mary's descendants are the modern British royal family. The line runs from George V through George VI to Elizabeth II, and onward to Charles III and beyond. Every monarch who has sat on the British throne since 1910 has occupied a position that was originally intended for Eddie. Every crown that has been placed on a sovereign's head since then has been placed there because a young man died of pneumonia at Sandringham in the winter of 1892, and the family rearranged itself around the loss. The monarchy endured. The institution survived. The name changed from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. The empire contracted into a commonwealth. The world that produced Eddie, the world of court circulars and deference, and the absolute conviction that what happened behind palace walls was the family's business alone, has been replaced by a world of press offices and social media, and a public that demands transparency with the same insistence that the Victorian public once offered silence. But the pattern persists: the management of image, the protection of the heir, the rearrangement of people to serve institutional needs, the silence that grows louder the longer it is maintained. Eddie's story is not unique. It is simply the version of the story that happened to produce, through the alchemy of murder, conspiracy, and public imagination, the most vivid afterlife. There is no need to pretend that the evidence points to Prince Albert Victor as Jack the Ripper. It does not. The contemporary records place him away from London for the key murders. The police never considered him a suspect. The conspiracy theories that named him emerged decades after his death from sources that were speculative, contradictory, and in at least one central case admitted fabrications. What the evidence points to is something more disturbing and more honest than a royal killer. A monarchy that trained its children to live behind curtains. A Victorian society that punished poverty while protecting rank. A sexual scandal that proved powerful men could escape consequences that destroyed the powerless. And a public imagination that was willing, eager even, to turn silence into guilt. Eddie had a title. The women in Whitechapel had names. The conspiracy connected them not through evidence, but through the gap that secrecy had left open. And the strongest image in the entire afterlife of the case is not a murder, not a confession, not a smoking document hidden in a royal vault. It is a small, quiet domestic act, a dead man's son standing in a room full of papers, reading enough to conclude there was nothing important and setting them alight. That fire did not destroy the truth. It created the conditions in which the truth would never be enough.